Good day. My name is Ooi Wei Zhuang and I will be presenting on the paper titled Translanguaging Pedagogy in the ESL Classroom, a systematic review for the course of Independent Study. This paper intends to explore the extent of current researches on translanguaging as an ESL pedagogy, then highlight the potentials, considerations, and trends of teaching and learning ESL with translingualism. The ability to use English is deemed essential to a degree that an estimation of 375 million English learners are identified as bilinguals or multilinguals. In contrast, teachers have continually practiced standard and classic English language teaching methodology in the ESL classroom to teach the target language by immersing learners in an English-only environment with minimal interference or use of their first language, L1. However, with the advancement of technologies, globalization, and social progress, English as a global language has made way for researchers and teachers to discover and innovate methods of ELT for multilinguals as the English learning classroom continues to include learners from diverse speech communities. Therefore, translanguaging has become an emergent strategy to develop bilingual or multilingual learners' ESL skills through systematic use of an individual's first language and English. Translingualism has pedagogic potential in the education of ESL, demonstrated in various research. Yet, translanguaging is still a niche concept in the teaching of learning of ESL. This systematic review paper extends the knowledge of translanguaging in the current ESL education, its challenges and benefits, and a clear direction for future research through exploring the extent of the concept in ESL teaching and learning from existing empirical studies. This paper will also serve as a guide for ESL educators and researchers on the uses of translanguaging pedagogy for ESL skills development. The paper will investigate the following questions. 1. What were the purposes or aims in the recent ESL translanguaging pedagogy research? 2. Where were the research settings in the studies? 3. Who were the research participants involved in the research designs and what was the nature of the data analysis in the studies? 4. What were the multilingual backgrounds of the participants involved? 5. What were the considerations regarding ESL translanguaging pedagogy found in the studies? This section will discuss the literature review of the paper. First, the concept of shifting from code switching to translanguaging. The concept of code switching was initially discovered in the social settings outside of the classroom, among communities that speak more than one language in the 20th century. Code switching ideologies view multilingualism or bilingualism as the practice of languages in separation, where language systems do not overlap and are used based on different purposes designated by the individual or community. Code switching holds a monoglossic view about languages, to which monolingualism is a norm and there is an unequal distinction between named languages used by multilinguals to pinpoint language dominance, elitism, or proficiency in comparison. Code switching was eventually integrated into the research of language learning, but researchers felt limited by its fundamentals since code switching observed in general the interchange of languages in and between sentences with attention to linguistic structures only. Code switching in the classroom was not established adequately for pedagogy purpose, and the use of first language was often referred as a learning interference that disregards individuals' linguistic background. Translanguaging looks beyond the delimiting principles in code switching by taking into account all languages used in the teaching and learning of another language as heteroglossic and interrelated to allow effective target language development. As a result, Goodman and Tastenberg proposed a comprehensive framework for researchers and educators to transition from code switching to translanguaging by highlighting the similarities and differences of each concept, as seen in Figure 1. For the similarities, code switching and translanguaging feature the blending of known languages when multilinguals converse inside or outside of the classroom context. They can either occur unplanned or with the intentions of teaching and learning content strategically. Teachers and students' attitudes and application of both concepts are common around the world that goes against monolingual conventions and the hegemony of English. It is believed that it contributes to negative or positive implications, which can bring about changes in the class or social context. As compared, translingualism is heteroglossic and views all signs or forms attempting to convey meaning as interconnected languages. All languages are valued to benefit multilinguals' learning, to process language experiences logically or subjectively, while developing a sound identity by harnessing their linguistic repertoire and resources at hand. As such, this study will be looking into translanguaging practices for the purpose of capturing the dynamic and progressive disposition of language mixing, alternations, fusion, and hybridity by multilinguals in their education, as supported by Garcia, Wei, and Goodman Tastenberg. As for the second section of the literature review, language teaching for ESL in the past had not referred directly to translanguaging for its pedagogic potential, although some traditional English language teaching methodology would support the use of the first language when teaching learners second language. These methodologies include grammar translation method, communicative language teaching, and natural approach, which stated incorporating the first language of learners in teaching helps to assess, prompt interactions, bolster comprehension for language learning. Although some methodologies discourage teachers to speak in the first language as they progress in learning or use first language solely for the purpose of translation. Translanguaging can be seen as an emerging trend in the teaching of English amid language classrooms consisting greater numbers of multilinguals in recent times. Moreover, Klein and Garcia proposed translanguaging practices to be adopted in the teaching of English as a second language, teaching of English to speakers of other languages, and teaching of English as a new language in response of reforming English language teaching and learning that were monolingual based before this. Translanguaging practices for ESL are observable and feasible in classrooms where learners are allowed to learn or produce English with flexible use of other languages when making sense of the target language content. Some instances are identified in Ophelia Garcia's and Hessen's translanguaging framework for educators. For example, bilingual or multilingual students should be able to access multilingual materials, ask questions or express themselves with their language repertoire before, during, and after listening, speaking, reading, writing English language tasks. For teachers, they should be able to provide multilingual instructions or feedback, create a safe place for multilingual interactions, model translanguaging, allow students to explain themselves with their language resources, assign peer support for translanguaging as means of ensuring students can understand then relate to the content of four English language skills. According to WHO 2020, who reviewed past papers related to translanguaging ranging from the year 2009 to 2019, translanguaging was generally used for three purposes: class control, explain linguistic content, and establish positive learning environment. Further studies recommend proving of language skills improvement using quantitative tests and extensive or longer research terms on the effects of translanguaging in ESL education. Hence, from the literature review, this paper seeks to bridge the gap and further extend information on current researches of translanguaging for the teaching and learning of ESL and relevant pedagogy concepts from state-of-the-art empirical research articles. This study used a systematic review method to inspect existing literature, identify and appraise the contributions, followed by the analysis, synthesis, and reporting of data based on the method's detailed and planned approach that can avoid bias selection commonly found in traditional literature reviews. The researchers of this study conducted a systematic review observing the 5 steps proposed by Han et al., which were 1. Framing questions for a review, 2. Identifying relevant work, 3. Assessing the quality of studies, 4. Summarizing the evidence, and lastly, 5. Interpreting the findings. The review literature pieces were located in Google Scholar database, whereas the literature search procedure was conducted during June 2021. The terms inputted into Google Scholar were translanguaging, ESL, English as a second language, L1, L2, ELT, English language teaching, pedagogy, bilingual, multilingual, and Manus book. An inclusion and exclusion criteria listed elements to inspect the qualities of the articles collected and further pinpoint suitable articles applicable to this research. The inclusion criteria are empirical studies examining translanguaging pedagogy in ESL education, studies that partially investigate translanguaging pedagogy, articles distributed in peer-reviewed journals, peer-reviewed journal articles with results and discussions, journal articles published between the years 2017 and 2021, and full-text peer-reviewed journal articles. Outlined in a Prisma flow chart adapted from Moher et al., there was a total of 82 results from Google Scholar. A total of 81 results remained after duplicates were removed. Then the results were screened and 53 results were excluded. 28 full-text articles were collected and read through, which led to 14 full-text articles being excluded. And finally, 14 peer-reviewed empirical journal articles were selected for the analysis in this systematic review. Moving on to findings and discussions, the research findings were tabulated and synthesized according to the analysis of 14 journal articles identified from the research criteria. The table below shows the literature synthesis metrics of existing studies related to translanguaging in ESL education and pedagogy. Based on the research findings, discussions were made. For research question number 1, what were the purposes or aims in recent ESL translanguaging pedagogy? 8 articles attempted to investigate directly the practice of first language in English language learning classes, code switching or translanguaging between first language and English as a target language. 7 of the 8 articles inquired their research participants about attitudes, perceptions, and views regarding utilization of first language or other languages when teaching and learning about ESL in the classroom. 4 studies examined the reasons for the occurrence of translanguaging purposes. 2 articles assessed the effects of translanguaging on learners. Then, a total of 6 articles reviewed had research purposes that did not reference translanguaging directly, but discussed concepts of translingualism with English as the second language as an outcome in their research. In short, for RQ1, latest research on translanguaging pedagogy have substantial data on students and teachers' perspective of the practice. Additional research on translanguaging pedagogy could expand on the functions of translanguaging in ESL teaching and learning, the impact of translanguaging as an ESL pedagogy on students' academic achievements, and the influences affecting teachers' and students' view of the translanguaging practice. Moving on to RQ2, where were the recent settings in the recent translanguaging studies? In terms of the research settings from the 14 articles reviewed, 12 different settings were identified. Recent research about translanguaging was not particularly concentrated in a geographical setting, but all research revolved around the theme of translanguaging in the ESL teaching and learning context. Translanguaging ESL pedagogy could still be broadened in the mentioned research settings, as well as other ESL learning environments not found in the articles. For discussions on RQ3, 6 studies had research participants who were teachers and pre-service teachers, 5 studies with undergraduate or postgraduate students, 1 study included both teachers and undergraduate students, another involved primary school children, and 1 study with people found in media. The latest translanguaging ESL pedagogy research were predominantly participated by teachers, pre-service teachers, postgraduate and undergraduate students in 12 out of the 14 empirical studies found. Further research could be done in favor of translanguaging ESL pedagogy for young ESL learners who are attending secondary, primary schools and preschools. To provide richer data, as Klein and Garcia asserted, translanguaging strategies in the ESL classroom are suitable and effective for emergent multilingual or bilingual students. Regarding research designs and the nature of data analysis in the studies, 6 research articles assessed were of mixed method research designs, while another 6 articles adopted qualitative research designs for their studies, followed by 2 articles using quantitative research designs. There is currently some considerable research information representing views of educators and learners about translanguaging in the teaching and learning of ESL in smaller or larger research participant groups, based on the 3 types of research methodology or designs across 7 articles. However, there is lesser quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method research on functions of translanguaging, factors influencing participants' views of translanguaging, and effects of translanguaging pedagogy in ESL learners that can be investigated by relevant parties. For research question number 4, the multilingual and bilingual backgrounds of the research participants found were diverse with relation to researching about translanguaging in the ESL classroom. Recent translanguaging research indicated most participants were bilinguals, followed by a small number of multilinguals. The translanguaging research may broaden its scope in terms of investigating multilingual ESL learners as a comparison to the data obtained from bilingual ESL learners. It was also proven that all authors of the empirical articles thoroughly examined and acknowledged all languages used by their participants, including global Englishes. For the final research question, the considerations regarding ESL translanguaging pedagogy found in the studies were: translanguaging with first language can function as cognitive strategies for summarizing, clarification, emphasis, and reiteration of crucial academic contents. The practice can better express teachers' opinions, thoughts, ideas, and feelings when addressing learners' behavior, then build positive rapport, improve language learning proficiency and interest with the students as a result, especially among learners with lower motivation and beginner English learners. There is a consideration that intermittent practice of translanguaging by ESL teachers could elevate learners' anxiety and encourage language learning as they gradually feel confident or comfortable in using the second language skills. Learners should be allowed to tap into all their linguistic resources to relate and make sense of the English language content being learned. Teachers should reassure learners to appreciate languages used by them as they actively discover similarities and differences, so it cultivates self-efficiency and self-directed language learning. Next, there should be incorporation of multimodal devices and the learner's first language that stimulate learners' visual, auditory, or kinesthetic senses simultaneously to improve teaching and learning efficiency in the ESL classroom. Educators should know learners' first language and be able to communicate with that language so teachers can develop their intercultural and intracultural competencies. Flexible language policies should be accounted for to eliminate linguistic disparities and allow relevant authorities to provide for learners' linguistic needs and preferences with translanguaging. Translanguaging pedagogy is preferred to reduce cognitive loads, explain conceptually complex language academic content, and develop higher order thinking skills. Collaborative and cooperative learning among peers are needed in translanguaging to progress students' language learning as well. In addition, student to student and student to teacher translingual interactions in the classroom should be encouraged. It allows learners to mutually negotiate, encode or decode meaning by employing linguistic, cultural, and contextual resources from their first language and second language. ESL educators must be open minded and confident towards learners' linguistic knowledge as a resource for successful learning to extend their teaching repertoire with translanguaging. Educators need to steer away from strict standardization of past English language teaching and the unrealistic ESL ideologies, such as speaking with an English native accent with perfect language accuracy. Teachers should consider the development of an individual's English communication competence as the practical aim for learners when translanguaging. Teachers should practice translanguaging with learners strategically, using a set of rules for the threshold of first language meshing, so a balance is achieved. Besides, teachers should consider translanguaging may occur lesser between advanced ESL proficiency learners who would only resort to first language use when facilitating for better flow of conversations, resolving miscommunications, engaging in advanced problem solving or learning complex content. Translingual, translingualism may be needed more frequently among beginner learners and gradually decrease as higher target language proficiency learners gain diversified learning strategies. In essence, considerations reviewed were extensive for planning, implementation, and research purposes on the subject matter. English language educators and researchers may refer the factors and issues discussed in this section about effective translingualism for English language teaching. As an end and conclusion to the paper, this review provided new insights for ESL education practitioners, researchers, policymakers, and other relevant parties on recent data regarding translanguaging as an ESL pedagogy or English language teaching. More in-depth studies could be done on the lesser research areas of the subject matter discussed, or concepts that were not mentioned in this paper to bridge the gaps and advance the research on translingualism for English language teaching. ESL educators and researchers can consult this review as a guidance when considering optimal and practical ways to conduct translingualism for the teaching of ESL. Some limitations were the results from the literature synthesis may simplify or overlook some points of the interest offered in the empirical studies. The empirical studies found were limited to only one database pertaining to a set of string of keywords searched in Google Scholar.